So my work, as Adam said, is about how people interact with emerging technologies, and usually that technology takes the form of robots. And to me, data are people's words, their stories, their experiences about living and working with robots every day. And part of my job sometimes is to look for patterns within and across these stories, and I can then sort of categorize them and present them as findings. But what I find really exciting to me as a scientist is that I get to look at the world through other people's eyes when they tell me their stories and how they're looking at and working with robots every day, their perceptions, their beliefs, their values, their trusts that are different than mine. But the thing is, you think of stories having a beginning, a middle, and an end, but all of these stories are situated within culture. And culture is a story that we write together collectively, every day together, and it's evolving. So how do you begin to disentangle all of these things? What I'm going to talk about today is a topic that some people find uncomfortable and other people find really exciting, and that is about what we're learning about ourselves, looking at the world through these robots, what it means to be human, humanness, and robotness. I'm going to begin by talking about the culture of war because some people say that war and defense work is some of the most extreme conditions, places where actually we can lose our humanity, but sometimes we find some of the greatest acts of humanity, of selflessness, of sacrifice. So war is a very interesting context in which to study human-robot interaction and to learn about being human. People go to war for reasons like duty and profit and passion. We say that we're building robots to use them as tools to increase our humanity or maintain our humanity because we're putting robots sometimes in place of humans in war. But the thing is, for robots, outcomes of war are purely quantifiable. They're about sometimes protection and self-protection, but these are things that have been programmed into them, and they're not related in the way that we understand, through human understanding, outcomes of war. To them, the environment is unpredictable, but to humans, war is often seen as chaotic. They have no human-like interest in things like duty, profit, passion, economic transactions, geographical boundaries, any of these motivations that we as humans have to go to war. They are purely tools. And I should say when I'm talking about robots, I'm talking about robot technology we have now and in the near future. Humans, we like to think that we're special. One reason is because we have a soul. But what is a soul? I'm going to tell you what a soul means to me. And that is subjective experience combined with imagination. The lifetime experience that you've accumulated collectively, your own experiences throughout life. Robots can have subjective experience, but we're not aware of them having any imagination. Their intelligence at this point, and probably in the near future, is pretty limited. But let's talk about imagination. Humans have the ability to create. We have this really cool thing where we can take internalized abstract concepts and externalize them and make them into concrete things. Tools like robots, for example. We use stories like science fiction as not just a framework or as stories or fables or folklore, but sometimes science fiction is a way for us to understand how we might interact with technology because it presents these scenarios to us of how we might interact with things like robots. We see the future as human as a set of ideas, as things that are unpredictable. And the fact that we know the future is unknown can inspire things in us like fear and empathy, these very human emotions, and our awareness that our time on this planet is finite. Robots can problem solve. They can invent and predict and model. They can help us simulate scenarios. But their future is going to be predicted on past experience purely algorithmically. Morality. We like to think that we have ethics or an inner compass, which is an interesting mechanical metaphor. We make choices constantly, every day, in our interactions with other people about what our moral things are going to be, our beliefs, our values, our trust system, our sense of justice or fairness. We decide every moment whether we're going to be ruthless or kind to each other. And we have an innate instinct for not just preservation of self, but preservation of those around us as a way to survive. Robots, some people are trying to build something called sometimes a moral engine. There's a group of scientists that are also trying to build something called an ethical governor. But really, that's going to be a set of algorithmic things based on a human understanding of morality. It's going to be a system of rules based on goal fulfillment and pure decision making. And sometimes it will be about preservation of others. Socialness. We can have meaningfully, emotionally, culturally embedded communication. Right now, I could wink at you. You might take it different ways depending on who you are, but you have an idea what a wink is. A robot doesn't have that kind of culturally embedded understanding of different sorts of communication. We have organizations and systems. We have social systems that we're all a part of. Our families, our workplaces, everything around us is part of systems. These organizations, there are hierarchies within these systems that we're aware of, and sometimes the hierarchies are formal, sometimes they're informal. We have friendships and meaningful relationships with those we care about that we're close to. Robots, some of them, can communicate to us in ways that we understand. They can sometimes communicate with each other. And sometimes when that behavior is coordinated, we call it swarming, which is an interesting insect-like metaphor, not a human-like one. Sex, sexuality. For humans, that often means emotional attachment. Sometimes it means things like romance and love. Some people say we have an instinct for sex, a need to reproduce for some of us, but we do it for other reasons, pleasure, desire, because we choose to. Whereas robots, if they're going to be imbued with sexual functionality, it's going to be a labor, a task, something they've been programmed to do, and won't necessarily have pleasure in it or a choice in a way that we understand. And some robots can actually replicate in that they can build other robots, but of course that's a robotness point of view in reproduction. Emotions. Sometimes emotions are referred to as irrational, but that's really more of a psychological term. I would argue that emotions are very rational. We're actually assessing our environment around us all the time. We're very aware of people and things and sounds, using all of our senses. And that can create in us physiological, biological changes that we react to. And based on our prior experiences, our own beliefs and experiences in the world, we formulate these emotions, how we're going to react. So emotions are really important in our decision-making process. And in that way, they're not irrational, they're based on our senses and our past experiences, and it affects concrete outcomes like decision-making. Emotions can change, they can evolve over time. Time is an important component. Somebody can be repulsed by a robot today and then over time become familiar with it. We do things like bond with each other. We have sentiment. We can also have the flip side of all these good feelings, and that is loss and mourning. Whereas robots can assess the environment, including others, other robots and other humans, but their reactions are going to be based not on emotion, but things like chance, probability, if-then statements. They do have ability sometimes to do machine learning, to learn about the environment about them, to even learn how to interact with other people. And some robots now are being marketed as social robots. But really what they're doing is maybe learning about the people around them in certain limited ways, and often mimicking expected behaviors, social behaviors back, so that we can communicate more easily with them. And sometimes it's to be persuaded to do things by the robot as a rhetorical means. Any bond you have with a robot is really one way at this point emotionally. To a robot, an interaction is a transaction. Bodies. It's really how we know the world around us. People judge us by our bodies, but we're aware of the world and we learn about the world through our bodies. Humans are interesting because as a species, we have a really prolonged infancy and childhood where we're dependent on caretakers. We're dependent on a mother-child or parent-child bond or some other caretaker so we can just survive. We have these great senses, smell, touch, sight, taste, all of these ways that we can know and learn about our world, and again, assess and be aware and appraise things around us. We evolve, we're unique, we're not replicable. We're not inherently weaponized unless you count things like hands and teeth, but most of us, unless you're, a black belt in karate, tend to not use these as weapons. We've evolved beyond that, so I would say we're not inherently weaponized. We have complex internal biological systems. We can extend our physical self with insight, with learning, with foresight and design. When you use tools like a robot, sometimes people, especially people operating a robot, will see it as an extension of themselves. I've talked to people who say, I use the robot is my hands at a distance. The robot are my eyes for me. When you think about it, that's not so different in some ways, except it's a more complex way of how we interact with technology all the time. Right now, I'm wired up. I've been joking like a cyborg in rehearsals. You think about someone who's visually impaired who uses a cane to tap on the ground. That's extending their physical self. It's more than just finding their way to see if there's things in the way. It's an extension of their cognitive self. They're using it to help them appraise their environment around them. Our bodies are fragile. We suffer. We have needs. We have to eat. We have to drink. We have to sleep. Robots can come out of the box, ready to learn. They don't have an infancy or childhood the way we understand it. Some robots that will interact with us will have a stage where they need to learn about you, but it's not an infancy in the way that we recognize a human infancy. They can be extrasensory. Their vision, their hearing can go into realms that we can't even imagine, things like infrared vision, super imaginative hearing. They can evolve as well, but robots can also be weaponized very easily where the weapons are integrated into their physical bodies. They also have complex internal systems that right now aren't really biological. They can extend their physical self sometimes quite literally, and they can be sturdy and inexhaustible where we are fragile. The mind. We talked about extension of self through tools. We have this great way that we can use tools. Our intelligence is beyond measurable intellectual ability. It's hard for us to even imagine sometimes. Learning is more than predicting the future based on the past. We have motivations, things like curiosity. That's a very human thing. We're swayed by things like rewards of pain, pleasure, ethics, desires. We can meaningfully encode and decode each other's words, our body postures, all of these things. We have instinct and intellect combined. But the mind is also fragile in that it can suffer from trauma or illness. Whereas robots also right now have an intelligence that's beyond measured intellectual capability, and for them, learning is purely predicting the future based on the past. They can encode and decode communication, but they don't have really the cultural meaning or understanding or embeddedness that we will have. They do have that intellect, but in their way, you could say, since robots are really, in essence, embodied artificial intelligence, that their minds, instead of trauma and illness, are vulnerable to things like hacking or just short-circuiting. Sentience, sometimes people refer to that as self-awareness. Again, it's a subjective experience based on our senses and perceptions. We get wisdom, this isn't me, this is Confucianism, wisdom through reflection, imitation, and experience. We have introspection and understanding of the world around us. We formulate our identities and we understand the boundaries between ourself and others. And all the time we have to distinguish what these boundaries are. We have judgment, situated cognition, which means I can understand, I can take something that I've learned and I can apply it to different situations. We're flexible that way. But again, we have an awareness of an uncertain and finite future. Robots also have a subjective experience based on senses and perception. It's a robot version of sentience. They too can get their version, their robot version of wisdom through a certain level of reflection, robot reflection, not human-like reflection, imitation, and experience. They have possibly in the near future their own version of introspection, understanding, and self versus the external world, but not in a way that we understand it. I understand this is me and that's you. But we don't understand how robots are going to understand self versus other. They can have a network of relationships with others, but again, it's going to be purely transactional and not culturally or emotionally invested. And to them, death is not a meaningful concept. There's an anthropological term called the endling, which I thought was a really neat term. But unfortunately, it refers to the last of a species. So as we are integrating all of this technology with us, living and working with robots every day, integrating technology into ourselves, and robotic technology, things like bionic prosthetic limbs that are used right now every day, and they're beginning to be implanted so they're not even removable. They're part of a human being. We can wear robotic exoskeletons to make us stronger, lift things heavier, extend our physical selves, and make us superhuman. Augment who we are, our bodies, and in that way, our minds, what we're learning about the world around us. When you combine this technology with our humanness, in essence, combining the robotness with humanness, and we have this increased, sometimes things like self-healing. And we're going to be self-aware, but are we going to be aware of time in a different way? Because we have these different augmented versions of ourselves. People will survive longer, sometimes because they can and they choose to integrate these technologies into themselves. So what I'm talking about today is a paradigm shift, and I don't have any easy answers, but it's something I wanted to leave you with to think about. And speaking of time, thank you for yours. Yeah.